Something that I think a lot of game developers do not stop enough and ask themselves, and I mean, we've made this mistake as well, is wonder, okay, I have this cool game idea. Is it actually any good? Is this really the game that I should be making? And I know I'm gonna get this out of the way because I always have to say this. If you're making a game and it's like, oh, I just want to make games just for me and I don't want to sell it or whatever, that's fine, then don't care about this video. But if you're planning on putting this game on a platform like Steam, for example, and you're actually expecting other people to play it, which, if you're being honest, is most of you, then I think you do have to ask yourself this question, because maybe you love Toho bullet hell games in a hand-drawn style, but the art is kind of shitty because it's your art. And it's fine, but there's probably not that many people who will also like that style of game. And that is something that you need to ask yourself. Do you want to make games truly for yourself, truly for the love of the game? If so, yeah, okay, ignore this, but know that probably your game will not be a massive success commercially. Or do you actually want to make sure that, hey, sometimes other people should want to play my game as well? And I want to talk about the 5 things basically that you should keep in mind when coming up with your game idea. And this is something not just when you get started with your game idea, but can be a good thing to just come back to like a month into development, for example, of, hey, is this idea still good? And I think the first most important thing, and it's the mistake that we've also made, is you need to have, from day one, you have an idea basically, you need to have a clear hook. So what is a clear hook? It's what hooks a player into caring about your game. How I often describe this, what is a good hook? Imagine you're on a Gamescom and you have your own little booth and you have all these people coming up to you. And they come up to you and they're like, hey, this art looked cool, like your capsule art or whatever. Can you tell me a bit more about what this game is about? And then your task is to figure out, okay, how do I, in like 1 or 2 sentences tops, pull this guy in and make him convert to playing my demo or whatever. You're doing basically the same thing on Steam as well, but it's very different if you're doing it in person. It's one thing we've done as well when we went to events to showcase Forge Industry. We had a really solid hook back then. To give you an idea, Forge Industry's hook was basically, hey, it's a factory automation game, but we have no conveyor belts. Like if you know a Factory or a Satisfactory, imagine that, but you're a blacksmith and there's no conveyor belts. Very short, but people immediately are like, hey, no conveyor belt? That's kind of interesting. Tell me more about it. Whereas if you are gonna be like, hey, yeah, it's another action roguelite and yeah, it's based in China this time, like based in martial arts China, that is not as strong as a hook. That is an example of another game that we worked on that we ended up canceling, Songs of Everjade, where we had this idea of, hey, yeah, we're gonna make a 2D pixel art action roguelite, because why not? And this is something that we had a lot of drama about in our studio because I thought it was a good idea. Now in hindsight, of course it wasn't. But Thomas was always like, where is the hook? Your setting isn't a hook. I think that's an important one. You can't just make the same game, but change like the setting unless you also change a lot of the mechanics underneath it, basically. Like, yeah, you can change the setting and it does a lot, but it doesn't stand on its own. There needs to be something else as well. Whereas like, hey, yeah, it's in a different setting and because of that, you change the mechanics of how you upgrade things, or whatever. Bring something new to the table. But if I'm saying, yeah, I'm making another boomer shooter, but this time you're slaying robots instead of aliens, it's like, yeah, no, nobody cares about that. So go away. I think this is the most important thing because everything else about your game is going to be based upon how good of a hook you have. All of your marketing materials, all of your game vision even, because if you don't fully understand what is the core important part of my game, automation, but without conveyor belts, for example, it can be hard to focus on that and you're gonna be making like 15 different mechanics, but you're not really certain what is the most important one. Now, once you've got that cool hook, you can start validating the second thing, and that is there an audience fit for this? Because, well, if you can explain to people what your game is about, that means that they can, in return, kinda let you know, are they interested in it, yes or no. This is, for example, very often with, hey, if you're making a city builder or a strategy game in 2025, for example, you generally can assume a pretty good audience fit because this is one of the best-selling genres on Steam. Whereas, for example, making a 2D platformer in 2025, probably not going to be as much of a fit anymore, as much of a demand. And even then, there still is something that you need to keep in mind. It's like, yeah, sure, there may be people who play that style of game. You're always going to have people at the end of the day who want to play your style of game. The question is, do those people still care about said genre of game in 2025, in 2026, whatever? Because I think one of my favorite examples is when someone is like, yeah, you know, the game Limbo, it's a 2D platform that made like $1 gazillion. I'm just gonna make a new Limbo. And it's like, cool, my brother, but we're not in 2013 anymore. The audience changes, like everything goes in waves. There was a period where battle royales were super popular and everyone wanted to play it. Then there was a roguelite deck builder like genre, and it keeps changing basically every 2 to 3 years. The new hotness kind of differs. And keep that in mind as well. Don't just look at, okay, are there a few people who are interested in the game? Yes. But second off, are they still interested or going to be interested in the game whenever my game releases? If you're thinking like, hey, I'm gonna make a survivor-like because survivor-likes are really hot right now, but then you end up taking 2 years to release, you're probably going to miss the mark because there's gonna be so many more games releasing in the next 2 years. And by the time that your game releases, maybe there will be another genre that is more popular, like, I don't know, roguelite fishing simulators or something. You can't plan for those changes in advance. So keep in mind, is it something like the start of the curve, or is it kind of an evergreen genre where probably people will still be interested in it a few years from now? Then next up is how streamable is my game? This is kind of your hook, but the hook once the game is like visual. What I mean with this is that, well, content creators and live streamers and YouTubers and whatever, they're probably going to be your main source of marketing. That's just kind of how game marketing has evolved, especially if you don't have big budgets like the big studios and you can't go to a Gamescom and rent out a giant booth and whatever. You need to have a game that, okay, the hook is one thing. You say the hook to someone and they're like interested in it. But that still means that they have to go to your Steam page and whatever. What is really important, I think, and something to consider as well from the beginning is how visually understandable and like how streamer friendly is the game. So what this means is, okay, imagine I am browsing Twitch and I see my favorite live streamer. He's playing a game. I click in on it, and within the first 5 seconds, can I understand what style of game he's playing and would it be something that interests me? I think this is pulling up to our own games. Unicycle Pizza Time was a great streamer-friendly idea of a game. Like, it was definitely the focus of that idea as well, but it's something that you can consider as well for your games. You click in on it and it's a 3D game, which is easier to understand for normies. And there's a unicycle on it. Immediately within like the first second, basically, if someone gets a first impression of your game, when they just drop in the middle, they're already kind of interested because there's not that many unicycle games, for example. Whereas if your game is a 2D pixel art top-down roguelite, it's gonna be much harder to immediately capture usually that visual appeal of what makes this game special. And sure, you have things like mechanics as well, but then the mechanics need to be shown often enough that a viewer can in like 15 seconds understand, hey, this is what the game's about and this is what separates it from all of the other games in a similar genre. I know that this is something that's kind of hard to plan for in the beginning, but it's kind of just thinking about, okay, what's going to be the visuals, what's going to be the main vibe and feeling that I want to give with my game, because you can already guess that you're probably not going to completely overhaul your visual style halfway through development. Or if you do, it's probably going to be because you realize that that streamability effect isn't good enough and something needs to change. And then another thing is scalability. This is something I alluded to in a previous video, where, you know, game development, making a 15-minute gameplay loop with like a cool mechanic isn't that hard, honestly. It's like, yeah, sure, you have to come up with the code, you have to set everything up in your engine, but it's not the hardest thing to do. Where a lot of problems arise is in taking that 10-15 minute long experience of whatever game you're making and expanding that to like a 2 or a 4 or a 10 hour or a 100 hour long experience. It's like, yeah, I have this cool mechanic, but will this mechanic get stale after more than 20 minutes, for example? This is a very big problem as well, where you start off with this great ambition and you have this really cool gameplay loop, but you realize that actually, yeah, it quickly runs out. Like, yeah, it's interesting for 20 minutes or something, but then you've kind of seen everything that that mechanic has to offer, and there's no content to keep you going, basically. There's no raising stakes and all of that. Those are things that take a lot of time as well. This is why, for example, roguelites, I think, are a great example that do this scalability well. You have a gameplay loop that is like your core run, if you're doing a roguelite, for example, and it takes like 15 minutes or whatever, but you add the scale and the replayability by doing things like timing it, having meta progression. All of that is kind of a good bang for buck way to scale your game so that it stretches out longer and people actually have a good experience. We're not talking about stretching your game out here artificially for the sake of, hey, I need to go past my 2-hour mark so people don't refund my game, because then they'll just give a bad review. And you're not really winning anything, but it's more of, okay, how do I keep this game meaningful for a long time? And this is something where, okay, you have that core mechanic, but you need to always keep in mind, can we take this a step further? Can we do more? Can we add more to make this a full experience? Maybe add story and whatever. How do we make this scalable? And then the last thing kind of linked to that is feasibility, because all of these things sound great. And you are like, okay, I found something, it's a unique hook, it's an MMORPG fishing game where you also manage a train station. Sounds cool, I'm gonna be making it in 3D high poly style or whatever, okay, all well. Probably going to be good for viewers and whatever. You've checked all of those 4 boxes. The problem is you're a one-man solo developer and you've only programmed your entire life and you've never learned 3D modeling. That kind of sucks. I understand that, but this is probably the hardest part, where sometimes, and this is something that you often have to just run into the wall a few times, even though I'm telling you this here, you have to fail, and you're going to notice where like 2 months into development, you realize that, hey, actually, I'm not a good 3D artist, for example. Surprise, turns out that never having done 3D modeling to suddenly making like finished high quality assets in like a month isn't really possible. And even if it is, the time that it takes just isn't feasible for your genre. This sucks. And it's something that we also refuse to accept for a long time. We're like, no, we can learn this. We've run into a wall a few times now, and we've learned from that. We've learned that, hey, stylized games is something that is very hard to pull off for us when you don't have dedicated artists, for example. So we're taking into account for the future game ideas that we have is always now, okay, is it a visual style we can pull off, for example? Like mechanics, we often trust at this point, we can probably make it work. Visuals is something where we really need to think for our studio ourselves. Is this something we can do? It may be the opposite for you. Maybe you're a really good artist and you're like, yeah, I can shit out assets every day of the week basically, but oh my god, I opened Game Maker Studio and it makes me want to cry. Different people have different skills, but I think understanding them and being real with yourself is the most important thing. Yeah, it can be nice to say like, yeah, I'm gonna learn programming as my resolution this year, but then a month in, you've made some cool assets, but it turns out that, hey, that game idea you were talking about of having giant multiplayer lobbies and all of that, it just didn't make sense at the end of the day, because you are stretched too thin. If you only have like 10 hours a week to program, well, you're not going to be making super complicated games and like super deep 4X games either. Unless you're planning on like spending 15 years on one game, and that's kind of it, which I also don't recommend. There's a lot more things also I think that you can talk about with game ideas, but to a certain degree, I think you always need to keep these things in mind. Like, I think the most important part still is always going to be your hook. What is something that your game is better at or is different at? Those are the 2 options. Either you're better than everything else or you're different than everything else, but you still have to be familiar enough in a certain genre, for example, that people still understand, oh yeah, it's like this game, but it does this thing completely different. That sounds interesting. With that out of the way, I do want to know your quirky game ideas, because I'm actually planning another video soon-ish where I want to go through some of your game ideas and talk a bit more about my thoughts behind all of them. So in the description down below, there's a form where you can submit your game idea. I pinky promise I'm not going to steal them and use them as my own. I'm not going to steal your multi-million-dollar game ideas. So go and fill in that form. It would make me happy. It's going to give you some great content as well. And whilst you're down there, why don't you just go ahead and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. It really makes me happy, and you get notified whenever we upload these videos 2 times a week. That's all I really have to say. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!